boot slammed against a pickup truck. A flashlight stabbed through the driver's window. A young trooper barked the same order 3 times, louder each time. The old man kept both hands on the wheel and did not flinch. The trooper yanked the door open and grabbed a fistful of denim jacket. He dragged the old man into the dirt beside the front tire. Cuffs clicked tight on thin wrists. A knee pressed down on a bony shoulder. The old man said nothing. He just looked at the night sky and breathed slow. The trooper laughed and called him a name no man his age should be called. The duffel bag in the truck bed sat untouched. Nobody knew what was inside it yet. The trooper had no idea what he had just done. His name was Frank Calder. Stay with me on this one. What happened next changed everything. The road outside Glasgow ran flat and empty for 40 straight miles. No streetlights. No traffic. Just a dented blue pickup truck moving steady under a half moon. Behind the wheel sat a man with white hair cropped close to the scalp. His hands were thick and scarred. A small silver cross hung from a chain on the rearview mirror. He drove with the radio off. He liked the quiet. He had earned the quiet. 3 miles back, he had stopped at a small white church and dropped off 2 bags of canned food at the side door. He did this every Wednesday. Nobody at that church knew his last name. They only knew him as Frank. Frank with the truck. Frank who never stayed for coffee. Frank who always wore the same denim jacket no matter the weather. The denim was patched in 2 places. The patches were older than the trooper who would soon pull him over. Frank had a wife waiting at home with a pot of soup on the stove. He had told her he would be back by 10. It was 9:15 when the red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. He slowed down the way he always did. He pulled onto the shoulder and put the truck in park. He turned off the engine. He placed both hands on top of the steering wheel where they could be seen. He had been a soldier a long time ago. Soldiers learn how to keep their hands visible. The cruiser door opened behind him. Boots crunched on gravel. The boots were new. Too new. The kind of new that meant the man wearing them had not learned much yet. Trooper Mason Hale was 26 years old and 3 months out of the academy. He had a square jaw and a fresh haircut and a chip on his shoulder the size of the state he patrolled. His father had walked out when he was 11. His mother had raised him alone in a trailer on the edge of town. He had something to prove to everybody and nobody at the same time. He approached the driver window with one hand on his sidearm. He shined his flashlight into Frank's face. He did not say good evening. He did not say license and registration. He said, "You know why I stopped you, old man?" Frank said, "No, sir, I don't." Mason said, "Your tail light is out." "The left one." Frank said, "I'll get it fixed in the morning." Mason said, "You'll get it fixed tonight or you won't be driving anywhere." Then he leaned closer and looked into the cab. He saw the cross on the mirror. He saw a folded blanket on the passenger seat. He saw nothing that should have raised his pulse. But his pulse rose anyway. Because some men cannot stand the sight of a quiet old man who does not flinch. The duffel bag in the truck bed was olive green. It had a name stenciled on the side in faded black letters. Mason had not seen it yet. He would. And when he did, the night would crack open like an egg. Mason told Frank to step out of the vehicle. Frank said, "Sir, I am 68 years old and my knees are not what they used to be. Can you tell me what this is about?" Mason said, "Step out." "Now." Frank opened the door slow. He set one boot on the gravel. He used the door frame to pull himself up. Mason did not help him. Mason watched him struggle and smiled a small, mean smile. He said, "Hands on the truck. Spread your feet." Frank did as he was told. He had done this exact pose 100 times in 100 countries. He could do it in his sleep. Mason patted him down rough. He pulled Frank's wallet from his back pocket. He flipped it open. He saw a Montana driver license. He saw a VA medical card. He saw a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. He did not look at the photograph long. He tossed the wallet on the hood of the cruiser. He said, "You been drinking tonight, old man?" Frank said, "No, sir. I don't drink." Mason said, "You smell like beer to me." Frank said, "That would be hard, sir. I haven't had a drink in 41 years. Mason said, "You calling me a liar?" Frank said, "No, sir. I am stating a fact." Mason said, "Watch your mouth." Then he grabbed Frank by the wrist and twisted his arm behind his back. Frank gasped once. A small sound. Almost nothing. The cuffs went on tight. Too tight. The metal bit into skin that had once been shot through with shrapnel in a jungle, a long way from Montana. Frank did not make a sound. Mason walked him to the cruiser and pushed his head down hard against the roof. He said, "Sit." Frank sat in the back of the cruiser. Mason slammed the door. Through the window, Frank watched the young trooper walk back to the pickup. Watched him circle it slow. Watched him stop at the tailgate. Mason climbed into the truck bed. He stood over the olive-green duffel bag. He read the stenciled name on the side. He frowned. He bent down and pulled the zipper. The zipper was old and stuck. He yanked it. The bag opened wide. Mason stared down into the bag for a long time. Then he stepped back. He stepped back again. He turned and looked at the cruiser. At the old man sitting silent in the back seat. At the wallet on the hood. At his own boots in the gravel. He took a long breath. He climbed down from the truck bed. He walked back to the cruiser slow. He opened the front door. He sat down in the driver's seat without saying a word. He stared at the steering wheel. The radio on his shoulder crackled. Once. Twice. Then it came alive. Not with dispatch. Not with the usual chatter. With 3 different voices on 3 different channels at the exact same moment. The night went very still. The first voice was a woman. Calm and steady. She said, "Unit 276. Confirm subject identity." Confirm subject identity now. Mason did not answer. The second voice was a man. Older. Sharper. He said, "Trooper Hale. This is Federal Liaison Bravo. Stand down and release the individual in your custody immediately." The third voice was the loudest. It was a deep voice with a slight southern drawl. It said, "Son, you listen to me real careful. You are about to make the worst mistake of your young life. You walk back to that cruiser. You open the back door. You take those cuffs off. And you do it before I get there." Mason's hand shook. He pressed the button on his radio. He said, "Who is this?" "Identify." The southern voice said, "You will know who I am in about 9 minutes. I am on the road from Billings. State your location." Mason said the mile marker. The southern voice said, "Do not move that man. Do not question him. Do not say one word to him that is not sorry. Are we clear?" Mason said, "Yes, sir." The southern voice said, "Out." The radio went silent. Mason sat alone in his cruiser with his hands gripping the wheel. He looked in the rear view at the old man behind him. The old man was looking right back at him. The old man's eyes were a pale washed-out blue. They were not angry. They were not afraid. They were just tired. Tired in a way that Mason had never seen on any face in his entire life. Mason opened his door. He got out. He stood on the gravel and looked up at the sky. The half-moon hung over the wheat fields. A coyote called somewhere far off. He thought about his mother. He thought about the trailer where he grew up. He thought about the framed photograph on her dresser of a man in uniform. A man she said was his father. A man she said had died overseas. A man whose name she would not speak. He thought about the way she would cry on certain nights. He thought about the way she had told him once, when she was drunk and sad, that a stranger had brought his father home in a box. That a stranger had stood at the foot of her bed and held her hand and told her the truth nobody else would. That this stranger had paid for the funeral out of his own pocket. That this stranger had never told her his name. She had only remembered one thing about him. She had remembered his eyes. Pale, washed-out blue. Tired in a way she had never seen on any face in her entire life. Mason walked very slow back to the cruiser. He opened the back door. He looked down at the old man. He said, "Sir, I need to." He could not finish the sentence. The old man said nothing. The old man just looked at him. Mason knelt down in the gravel. He reached behind the old man's back. He took the cuffs off with shaking hands. He helped the old man stand. He brushed the dirt from his denim jacket the way a son might brush dirt from a father's coat. He said, "There is water in the front seat. Would you like some water?" The old man said, "Yes, son. I would." Mason walked him to the front passenger seat of the cruiser. He helped him sit. He handed him a bottle of water. The old man took a small, slow sip. He set the bottle on his knee. He looked out at the wheat fields. He said, "Pretty country up here." Mason stood beside the open door and stared at the gravel. He did not trust his own voice. The crickets started up again. The radio stayed quiet. For one full minute, it felt like the world had simply stopped. Frank rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes. He looked like he might fall asleep. Then a single set of headlights came over the rise. The headlights were high and white. They moved fast down the empty road. Too fast. The vehicle was a black SUV with government plates. Behind it came a second SUV. Behind that came a third. They slowed and lined up nose to tail along the shoulder. Doors opened. 8 men got out. None of them wore uniforms. They wore dark jackets and earpieces. They walked the way men walk when they have walked into rooms 100 times not knowing what is on the other side. The lead man was tall and lean with iron gray hair. He wore boots that were old and well-loved. He walked straight to the cruiser. He did not look at Trooper Hale. He looked through the open passenger door at Frank. He said, "Colonel." Frank opened his eyes. He smiled a small, tired smile. He said, "You drove fast." The tall man said, "I drove the way you taught me to drive." Frank said, "Then you drove too fast." The tall man laughed. It was a short laugh. The kind of laugh men give when they are trying not to cry. He knelt in the gravel next to the cruiser. He took Frank's hand in both of his. He said, "Are you hurt, sir?" Frank said, "No. I am fine." The tall man looked up at Mason for the first time. His eyes were also pale, washed-out blue. "But not tired." "Not yet." He said, "You?" Mason said, "Yes, sir." The tall man said, "Walk with me." He stood. He turned and walked toward the wheat field. Mason followed. They stopped 20 yards from the road. The tall man turned to face him. He said, "Do you know who that man is?" Mason said, "No, sir." The tall man said, "His name is Frank Calder. Colonel Frank Calder, United States Army, retired. He commanded a special operations unit in 3 different theaters over 28 years. He has more decorations than any living veteran in the state. He has saved more American lives than you will ever meet in your entire life. And tonight you put him on the ground and you cuffed him for a broken tail light." Mason said, "Sir, I didn't." The tall man said, "Stop talking. I am not finished." Mason closed his mouth. The tall man said, 22 years ago, Colonel Calder pulled my father out of a burning helicopter in a place I cannot name. My father lived another 9 years because of that man. My father got to walk me down the aisle because of that man. My father got to hold my son because of that man." The tall man's voice did not break. But his hand did. It clenched at his side. He said, "Do you understand what I am telling you?" Mason said, "Yes, sir." The tall man said, "Now I am going to ask you a question. And you are going to answer me honestly. What is your father's name?" Mason said, I never knew him, sir. He died overseas before I was born. The tall man went very still. He said, what was his name, son? Mason said, my mother said his name was Daniel Hale. The tall man closed his eyes. He stood there in the wheat with the wind moving through it. He opened his eyes. He turned and looked back at the cruiser. He looked at the old man sitting in the front seat. He looked at the old man for a long time. Then he turned back to Mason. He said, son, I need you to sit down. Right here in the dirt. Mason sat. The tall man knelt down across from him. He said Daniel Hale was a corporal in Colonel Calder's unit in 2001. He was 23 years old. He had a pregnant wife at home in Montana. The colonel was his team leader. The colonel carried your father out of an ambush on his back for 2 miles through enemy fire. Your father did not make it. The colonel sat with him while he died. The colonel held his hand. Your father said one thing before he went. He said, tell my boy I tried. The colonel went home 3 weeks later. He found out where your mother lived. He drove to her trailer in his own truck. He stood at the foot of her bed, and he held her hand, and he told her every word your father said. He paid for the funeral out of his own pocket, because there was nothing the army would not pay for fast enough. He has sent a check to a post office box in this town every single month for 26 years. He has never put his own name on the check. He has never asked your mother for a thing. Your mother does not know who the checks are from. But I know, because I am his godson. And he is the reason I am sitting here in this wheat field with you tonight. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. There is more to this story, and I want you to hear all of it. Mason did not move. The wind moved the wheat. The tall man waited. Mason put his face in his hands. He did not cry. He just sat there in the dirt for a long time and breathed. The tall man stood up and walked back to the cruiser alone. Mason stayed in the wheat. He could not move yet. He watched the tall man kneel beside Frank and speak in a low voice. He saw Frank nod once. He saw Frank pat the tall man's hand. He saw the other 7 men standing in a half circle around the cruiser, the way Secret Service stands around a president. Nobody spoke loud. Nobody moved fast. There was a strange holiness to it, like a church service in the middle of a highway. The tall man waved Mason over. Mason got up. His legs were not steady. He walked back across the wheat. He stopped 2 feet from the cruiser. Frank was looking up at him with those tired blue eyes. Frank said, son, come closer. Mason stepped closer. Frank said, I want you to listen to me. Mason said, yes, sir. Frank said, your father was a good man. He was scared the night he died. Every man is scared. But he was brave too. He carried 2 of his brothers out of that house before he was hit. He saved 2 lives that night. You should know that. Mason said, yes, sir. Frank said he talked about your mother. He talked about the baby. He did not know yet if you were a boy or a girl. He hoped for a boy. He said he wanted to teach you how to fish. He said he wanted to teach you to drive a stick. He said a lot of things in that last hour, son. I remember every word. I have carried every word with me for 26 years. Mason's mouth was open, but no sound came out. Frank said, tonight is not your fault. Mason said, sir, what I did to you. Frank said, tonight is not your fault. I am telling you. You did your job. You did it wrong, but you did your job. You are angry. You have been angry your whole life. I understand. Your father was angry too when he was your age. He grew out of it. So will you. Mason said, sir. I am so sorry. Frank said, I know. Frank held out his hand. His hand was thick and scarred. Mason took it. Frank squeezed once. He said, now help me up out of this cruiser. I want to go home. My wife is holding supper. She does not like to wait. Mason helped him stand. He helped him walk back to the dented blue pickup. The 7 men in dark jackets stood at attention as they passed. The tall man walked behind them. Frank climbed slow into the driver's seat. He shut the door. He rolled the window down. He looked at Mason. He said, "You come for supper Sunday. My wife makes a roast. You come hungry." Mason could not speak. He just nodded. Frank turned the key. The engine started. He put the truck in gear. He pulled onto the empty road and drove off slow into the dark. His one good tail light glowed red until it disappeared over the rise. The tall man came to stand beside Mason. They watched the road for a long time after the tail light was gone. The tall man said, "He has waited a long time to meet you." Mason said, "Why didn't he tell me?" The tall man said, "Because that is not the kind of man he is. He didn't want to thank you. He wanted you to grow up safe. He wanted your mother to have food on the table. He wanted you to have a chance. He has been watching you from a distance for 26 years, son. Every birthday, every report card your mother taped to her fridge. He has known about all of it. He never asked for credit." Mason said, "How does he know about my report cards?" The tall man smiled a small, tired smile. He said, "We watch what we love, son. We just do." Then he put his hand on Mason's shoulder and squeezed it once. He said, "Go home, son. Go to your mother. Tell her tonight. Don't wait till morning. She has been waiting 26 years for the answer to a question she stopped asking out loud. Tonight you can give it to her." Mason wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, "Yes, sir." The tall man let go of his shoulder. He turned and walked back to the line of black SUVs. He climbed into the lead one. The other men climbed in too. The engine started. The headlights came on. The line of SUVs pulled onto the empty highway and drove off slow. They did not use lights or sirens. They just drove off in the same direction Frank had gone. Mason stood alone on the gravel shoulder and watched until the last set of tail lights disappeared over the rise. Then he walked back to his cruiser and sat down behind the wheel and put both hands on top of it, the way Frank had done in the truck a half hour earlier. He closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, his father had a face. Mason did not finish his shift that night. He drove his cruiser back to the post in silence. He parked it. He sat behind the wheel in the dark lot for a long time. Then he went inside and walked straight into his sergeant's office and told him every single thing that had happened on that highway. The sergeant listened. He did not interrupt. When Mason was finished, the sergeant set down his coffee and stood up and shook Mason's hand. He said, "Son, you did right by coming in here. You did wrong out there. Both can be true." Mason said, "Yes, sir." The sergeant said, "You will face the board. You will probably take a suspension. You may lose this job. I will not lie to you. But you came in here yourself and told the truth. That matters." Mason said, "Yes, sir." The sergeant said, "Go home and sleep, son. Tomorrow you start over." Mason drove home in his own truck. He did not turn the radio on. He did not stop for gas. He pulled into the gravel drive at the trailer where he had grown up and where his mother still lived. The kitchen light was on. She was still up. He sat in the truck for 10 minutes before he could go inside. When he went inside, she was at the table with a cup of tea and an old photo album open in her lap. She looked up. She said, "You're home early." He said, "Mama, I need to tell you something." He sat down across from her. He told her everything. He told her about the old man in the denim jacket. He told her about the duffel bag and the medals and the folded flag. He told her about the radio and the 3 voices. He told her about the tall man with the iron gray hair. He told her what the tall man had said about her trailer and about the stranger at the foot of her bed. He told her about the check that had come every month for 26 years. She did not say anything for a long time. She turned a page in the photo album. She turned another. She stopped on a page with a single picture. A young man in uniform. Corporal Daniel Hale. She put her hand on the picture. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she did not make a sound. Then she said, "His name is Frank." Mason said, "Yes, Mama." She said, "I always wondered. I always knew it was someone. I just didn't know who." She closed the album. She wiped her eyes on her sleeve. She said, "Sunday." "You said Sunday." Mason said, "Yes, Mama. He invited us to supper." She said, "Then we go. We bring a pie." She got up from the table and walked to the kitchen and started pulling flour out of the cabinet at midnight. Mason sat at the table and watched his mother bake a pie for the man who had carried his father out of a burning house in a country she could not name. He understood for the first time in his life that some debts do not get paid in money. They get paid in pie. They get paid in Sunday suppers. They get paid in showing up. Sunday came. Mason and his mother drove the 11 miles out to the small farmhouse where Frank lived. Frank was waiting on the porch. His wife stood beside him with a dish towel in her hands and a smile that broke her face wide open. Frank's wife was small and white-haired, and her eyes filled the moment she saw Mason's mother step out of the truck. The two women had never met before. They walked toward each other across the lawn. They met in the middle. They stood there holding each other and crying without saying a word for a long minute. Frank put his hand on Mason's shoulder. He said, "Come on, son. The roast is ready." They ate at a small wooden table in the kitchen. Frank said grace. He thanked God for the food. He thanked God for the company. He did not mention the highway. He did not mention the cuffs. He did not mention the radio. After supper, Frank took Mason out to the barn. He opened a footlocker. He pulled out a small wooden box. He handed it to Mason. He said, "This is your son. It was your father's." Mason opened the box. Inside was a folded letter and a single dog tag and a small St. Christopher medal on a chain. Mason read the letter standing in the barn with Frank watching from a few feet away. The letter was in his father's handwriting. It was written the morning before he died. It was addressed to his unborn child. Mason read it twice. He folded it slow. He looked up at Frank. He said, "Sir." "Thank you." Frank said, "You're welcome, son." Mason said, "For everything." Frank said, "Don't thank me. Thank him." Mason nodded. He held the box tight against his chest. The barn smelled like hay and old wood. The sun was going down. Somewhere a tractor started up. Frank put his arm across Mason's shoulders. They walked back to the house together in the long gold light. Mason kept his job. He took a 30-day suspension. He came back to the post a different man. He still wore the uniform, but he wore it lighter. He pulled people over slower now. He looked at faces longer. He listened more than he talked. He drove out to Frank's farmhouse every other Sunday for the rest of the old man's life. Frank lived another 7 years. When he passed, Mason wore his dress uniform to the funeral and stood at attention beside the casket. The tall man with the iron gray hair stood on the other side. 7 other men in dark jackets stood behind them. A folded flag was placed in Frank's wife's hands. She held it against her chest. She looked at Mason. She smiled through her tears. She mouthed 2 words at him across the chapel. "Thank you." Years later, Mason's own son would ask him about the dog tag on the chain his father wore under his uniform. Mason would sit the boy down at the kitchen table. He would pour him a glass of milk. He would tell him the whole story. The pickup truck, the broken taillight, the duffel bag in the bed, the 3 voices on the radio, the old man with the tired blue eyes who had carried his grandfather out of a burning house. The boy would listen the way only a child can listen. Mouth open, eyes wide. And when Mason was done, the boy would ask the only question that mattered. Daddy, was he a hero? Mason would think for a long moment. Then he would shake his head slow. He would say, no, son. He was better than that. He was a quiet man who did right when nobody was looking. And on the empty road outside Glasgow, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the wheat just right, the old-timers swear you can still hear a slow blue pickup truck driving home with one good tail light glowing red until it disappears over the rise.